Finally, time for another trip. This time out west to the great state of Utah, where we checked out Arches and Canyonlands National Parks. Our best buddy Justin received a great opportunity for employment in the Salt Lake City area of Utah, so we packed up his car with all his belongings and hit the road in the middle of the night. Here we are crossing the Mississippi River into Iowa. What would any trip west be without a stop at the I-80 truck stop, the world's largest? This place has everything you could ever want or need when it comes to a road trip. So we loaded up on snacks, we got back in the car, we got as many miles under us as we could before we had to pull over for the night. After just a couple hours of sleep, we were on the road again, heading towards Denver, where we were picking our friend Ben up from the airport. He would be joining us through our destination of Moab and eventually Salt Lake City. We put the city in the rear view and headed up into the mountains for one of the most scenic drives in the entire country. Just the sight of these snow-capped peaks in the Colorado Rockies are worth a trip all to themselves, even if it is just down Interstate 70. 'Cause up here, even the road stops are beautiful. We continued making our way west through the winding valleys. We even passed through a couple tunnels. Here's the Eisenhower Tunnel, completed in 1973, an engineering marvel at the time. We continued past more snow-covered peaks and through more tunnels, and eventually the scenery began to change. The towering slopes of evergreen give way to sheer red cliffs on the west end of the Rocky Mountains. We descended down into Utah just before dark, with enough time to catch our first glimpse of canyon country. As soon as we arrived in Moab, we made our way towards the Ledges camping area, one of the many BLM campgrounds along Cane Creek Boulevard. Later on, we would see just how beautiful this road actually is, but for our first trip, we were hugging the canyon wall in complete darkness. And getting passed by a group of off-roaders going about double your speed coming out of the dark canyon, well, that makes for a pretty proper introduction to Moab. In the morning, we headed just up the road towards Arches National Park. From behind the visitor center seen here, the road winds up to the top of this plateau, where the landscape opens up into a vast area full of incredible rock formations. We decided to start our trip by driving all the way to the back of the park and working our way back towards the entrance. These two massive rock formations are called the Courthouse Towers.
Arches is the home to the largest natural collection of rock arches found anywhere in the world, on top of hosting an impressive amount of other geological formations as well.
Since we planned on seeing as much as we could of the park in one day, most of the arches we stopped at were some of the easiest hikes and most accessible spots from the car. For our first hike of the afternoon, we made it all the way to the Devil's Garden Trailhead to see Tunnel Arch, Pine Tree Arch, and Landscape Arch. Pretty much all of the arches in the park require some kind of short walk, but the trails are nice and wide and well maintained. They also have quite a few primitive trails for those looking for a little more of a challenging and naturalistic type hike. Finally, to our first arch of the day. This is the brilliant Tunnel Arch. Just a little ways further down the trail, we came across Pine Tree Arch. This is where the trail ends for us hikers, so we poked our head through the arch and soaked up the views of the landscape around us. Then we had to turn around and head towards the next arch. Here's Landscape Arch, the longest spanning arch in all of North America. Absolutely one of the most beautiful photogenic arches in the whole park. We decided to continue on past Landscape, up the primitive trail to the top of the canyon wall. The trail continues on for more great hiking and a couple more arches, but we stopped, saw what we could, and had to head back to the car to see more sections of the park. For our next set of arches, we are off to see Skyline Arch, Sand Dune Arch, and then Broken Arch. This was one of the closest arches to the road and accessible through a very short hike that takes you right up to the bottom for amazing views. Sand Dune Arch is located within a canyon. The hike there takes you through some incredibly tight spaces, and on a windy day like today, the sand can blast through there at some painfully fast speeds. But this one was definitely worth the hike. The Sand Dune Arch Trail was the most enclosed point we were in the entire day. It was a nice alternative given that the landscapes of the park are generally vast and open. The trail continues on down to Broken Arch, our next stop. This neat little arch is located at the end of a long sandstone wall. The trail actually continues up and through the arch, allowing us to head up for some great scenic views, and naturally we had to snap a couple pictures. Next, it was back to the car, where we headed on towards the Fiery Furnace, yet another one of Arch's many geological attractions. Although it's not an arch, this landscape is still impressive in its own right. We checked out the viewing point, stretched our legs, soaked up the scenery, took our pictures, and then we were back to the car. Next stop was the main attraction of the park. We were heading towards Delicate Arch. We parked the car at Wolf Ranch, where there's a trailhead that will take you all the way to the base of the arch. There's also an original homestead, as well as a set of Native American petroglyphs on the rocks. The hike up involves a decent amount of elevation gain, but there's really not a single bad spot to stop and catch your breath. The front portion of this hike offers incredible views all around, but it gets particularly interesting on the backside when the trail narrows down above a steep canyon wall. of a sudden, we turned the corner and there it was, the arch, the most famous arch in the park. This is Delicate Arch. You might recognize it if you've ever seen a license plate from the state of Utah. This 60-foot tall rock structure is the last remaining piece of sandstone left, towering above the canyon below. It's an absolute must-see if you stop in Arches National Park. Well worth the hike if you're able to get up here. You may have to wait out a few groups of people if you're looking to get the best photos. This is one of the most popular spots in the park after all. But if you're patient enough, it's well worth it. We took in the views all over again on the hike back down to the car, where we got back in and headed towards the windows section of the park to see our next set of arches. We hit the trail in a counterclockwise direction, starting with Turret Arch. Next we have the north and south window arches. Next we hiked down to Double Arch, of which the southern span is the tallest arch in the park, coming in at 112 feet above the ground. The windows section is a must if you're planning on visiting Arches, and you could see all of these in as little as a half hour, or you could easily spend most of your day hiking the primitive trails around this area. After catching a quick glimpse of the Garden of Eden, we stopped to check out Balanced Rock. This is a nearly 3,600-ton boulder balancing atop a very narrow pedestal. It's one of the most iconic sights in the whole park. Our final stop for the day was the formation called Park Avenue. I would love to come back sometime and hike the trail that goes right down the middle. The canyon walls here are absolutely massive, and the rock formations look like skyscrapers towering around you. With a little bit of imagination, you can see why they named this valley after the famous Park Avenue of New York City. It was time to end our day here, so we headed back for some rest, and we geared up for Canyonlands National Park in the morning. But first we headed back towards the Ledges campground to pick up our friend Pete, who would be joining us on this adventure today. We finally got to see Cane Creek Boulevard in the daylight. This drive was just as beautiful and impressive as any of the national park lands that surround it. The whole area surrounding Moab, Utah is breathtaking. An absolute must for any hiker, biker, or adventurer looking to get away. I just could not get enough of the view from the campground. The drive is incredible all by itself. You can see free-ranging cattle, canyon views, river views. You can stop and see petroglyphs. There's arches to hike to along this drive. It's absolutely amazing. But for us, it was time to head north of Moab. Just a little ways past Arches, it's the entrance to Canyonlands National Park, the Island in the Sky section. Our first stop was the Green River Overlook. This was an awesome introduction to the park and just a glimpse of some of the views we were going to get to see this day. One of the amazing things about the Island in the Sky section of Canyonlands is that even with the vastness of the landscapes, it seems that around every corner is a new view of the park. Each overlook seems to offer a unique view of either the Green or the Colorado rivers and the canyons that they've carved out over the millennia. Our next stop was Upheaval Dome, an interesting geological formation that's a mystery to this day as to how it formed. The consensus is still out on whether this is a meteorite strike from space or if it's the result of a fractured salt dome from underneath an ancient sea. Either way, it was gorgeous to look at. On our way to our next destination, we stopped by the side of the road and followed a small footpath to the edge of this wall, where we were pleasantly surprised with this amazing view. Next up, Buck Canyon Overlook, my personal favorite from the whole day. The scenery was unbelievable. Next up was the Grand Viewpoint Overlook. It does require a hike out along the steep canyon wall to get there, but once you're at the viewpoint, you're greeted with the most spectacular scenery of both sides of the massive canyon. With a complete 360-degree view like this, I felt like I was sitting on top of the world. For our last stop before leaving Canyon Country for good, we hit Mesa Arch. This is a really cool spot because it's one of the rare cases where you're not just looking up at the arch. This allows you to take pictures through the arch with the landscape scenery in the background. We made the short hike back down to the car where we would be making our way for the exit. We caught our final glimpses of the canyons, and we made our way north towards Salt Lake City, Utah. The first thing I did in the morning was immediately take a hike up one of the foothills to check out the surroundings of the city. During the afternoon, we made a couple of stops downtown to see the views and the sights down there. We even made it all the way to the Great Salt Lake, where we checked out the water and even were able to take a small hike along the beach. We actually ended our day heading up into the mountains towards the Park City area, and I was even able to take a hike in some snow. So from beautiful red-walled desert canyonlands to snow-covered mountains, the state of Utah really does have it all. Unfortunately for me, it was time to soak in my last views and let Justin settle into his new home. I left Utah feeling extremely happy and fulfilled about our adventure, but I know there's so much more left to see. I, for one, cannot wait to go back.